The golden age of cinema has always been a masterful illusion, a shimmering tapestry woven from the dreams of millions and the calculated perfection of the studio system. In the heart of this sun-drenched paradise, where the scent of jasmine mingled with the exhaust of expensive convertibles, the world learned to worship a new kind of deity. They were the screen idols, men and women whose faces were projected dozens of feet high, larger than life and seemingly immune to the fragile realities of the human condition. Under the brilliant glare of the studioed spotlights, every smile was meticulously choreographed, every tear was a work of art, and every romance was designed to sell tickets. Millions of fans across the globe looked at these radiant figures and saw immortality, a promise that beauty and grace could endure forever in a world that was rapidly changing. The studio gates acted as the walls of a modern Olympus, keeping the mundane world out and preserving a carefully manufactured paradise where the music never seemed to stop playing. Yet, behind the heavy velvet curtains and the imposing wrought iron gates of the great backlots, another reality existed entirely in the shadows. The very lights that made these stars shine so brightly cast the deepest, most suffocating shadows, hiding the immense pressure, the exhaustion, and the silent cries for help that the public was never meant to hear. For one particular icon, whose presence on the screen defined the very essence of sophistication and alluring mystique, the camera was both a savior and a relentless captor. To the audience, this individual was the ultimate symbol of success, an untouchable force of nature who moved through the gilded halls of Hollywood with effortless elegance. The songs they sang and the lines they delivered felt like intimate promises, whispered directly to each lonely soul sitting in the dark theater. But when the directors shouted "cut" and the heavy studio doors closed against the prying eyes of the press, the silence that followed was often deafening. The industry demanded absolute perfection, an unyielding devotion to the image created by the studio executives, regardless of the personal cost. Every gesture, every public appearance, and even the most private moments were scrutinized and managed by a machinery that viewed human beings as highly profitable commodities. As the years progressed and the applause grew louder, the gap between the public persona and the private soul began to widen into a dangerous chasm. The music that accompanied their rise to fame began to carry an undertone of melancholy, a haunting melody that hinted at a growing isolation deep within the glamorous fortress. Rumors began to circulate in the hushed corners of elite Hollywood parties, whispered secrets about late-night breakdowns, desperate longings for escape, and a fragility that threatened to shatter the flawless porcelain facade. The world was captivated by the brilliance of the light, completely unaware that the countdown to an inevitable, heartbreaking eclipse had already begun. The journey into the heart of the spotlight always began with a transformation, a deliberate shedding of one's past, to become a creature entirely manufactured for public consumption. For our protagonist, the transition from an ordinary life to the pinnacle of cinematic royalty was a dizzying whirlwind of wardrobe fittings, elocution lessons, and the careful curation of a gaze that could captivate an audience in a single frame. The early years on the studio lot were filled with the intoxicating aroma of fresh paint on elaborate sets, the rhythmic hum of the cameras, and the electric energy of a creative empire operating at the absolute peak of its powers. It was an era when the studios controlled every facet of a performer's existence, dictating who they could be seen with, what they wore to premieres, and how they spoke to the eager reporters who gathered like hawks around the red carpets. The golden years brought an avalanche of adulation, with lines stretching around city blocks just to catch a glimpse of their name illuminated in neon against the night sky. Every film was a monumental triumph, every performance hailed as a masterclass in emotion, and the world seemed to spin entirely around the magnetic axis of this newly crowned legend. They became the definitive face of a generation, a symbol of unattainable luxury and effortless grace that defined the aspirations of a society seeking escape from its own daily struggles. Behind the scenes, however, the gears of the Hollywood machine were grinding relentlessly, demanding an exhausting schedule of back-to-back productions that left little time for sleep, let alone self-reflection. The first whispers of difficulty began to manifest, not as a sudden crisis, but as a subtle, creeping exhaustion that settled deep into the stars' eyes, hidden only by the masterful artistry of the studio makeup department. Behind-the-scenes intrigues grew increasingly complex as rival executives maneuvered to exploit this immense popularity, trapping the performer in a golden cage of ironclad contracts and mounting financial expectations. The very people who had orchestrated the rise to fame were now the ones policing every boundary, ensuring that the public never caught a glimpse of the gathering storm clouds. The illusion of complete autonomy was carefully maintained for the fans, but behind closed doors, a bitter struggle was unfolding for control over the stars' career, their image, and their very identity. In the quiet hours between midnight and dawn, when the music of the lavish studio parties finally faded into the distance, the weight of the crown became almost unbearable. The glamorous facade was a masterpiece of public relations, a shimmering shield designed to deflect any suspicion that the studio's greatest asset was beginning to fracture under the immense, unyielding pressure of stardom. Every smile captured by the photographers became a testament to willpower, an act of sheer defiance against a growing sense of isolation that no amount of applause could ever hope to cure. The studio demanded a constant stream of perfection, treating the human being at the center of the phenomenon as nothing more than a highly profitable illusion that must be preserved at any cost. As the tension behind the scenes reached a fever pitch, the whispers among the crew members and close associates grew louder, painting a portrait of a fractured soul desperately searching for a way out of a beautiful prison. The glittering world of high society continued to marvel at the star's brilliance, entirely oblivious to the fact that the foundation of this magnificent empire was quietly beginning to crumble from within. The tipping point arrived not with a sudden explosion, but behind the heavy, soundproof doors of a private executive suite, far from the flashing bulbs of the paparazzi. It was here that the conflict between the human soul and the corporate machine finally erupted into a scandal that the studio heads had spent years trying to prevent. The carefully constructed facade of the flawless icon was shattered in a single evening, revealing the deep, unhealed fractures that had been festering beneath the glamorous exterior. What transpired behind those closed doors was a desperate confrontation, a breaking point where the star refused to play the role of the obedient puppet any longer, demanding the right to their own life, their own choices, and their own sanity. The studio executives, terrified of losing their most lucrative property and seeing their pristine reputation tarnished, immediately shifted into a state of absolute damage control. The machinery that had once been used to elevate the star to the heavens was suddenly turned against them, weaponized to enforce silence, compliance, and total submission. Rumors of a sudden, mysterious illness were quickly fed to the eager entertainment columnists, while the true nature of the breakdown, the desperate cries for help, the dependency on substances prescribed just to keep them working, and the emotional exhaustion was buried deep within the studio archives. Society, conditioned to worship the illusion, was kept completely in the dark, fed a steady diet of carefully staged public relations photographs and pre-written press releases that claimed everything was perfectly fine. Yet, the atmosphere on the set had changed permanently. The previous warmth and creative energy were replaced by a chilling clinical efficiency that felt more like a prison than a film studio. The turning point altered the hero fundamentally, extinguishing the genuine spark that had once made their performances so magical and replacing it with a haunting, detached professional precision. They became a ghost haunting their own life, moving through the motions of stardom while the industry elite watched with a cold, watchful eye, ready to suppress any further signs of rebellion. The silence imposed by the studio system was absolute, as other actors and crew members were explicitly warned that a single misplaced word to the press would mean the immediate end of their own careers. This conspiracy of silence ensured that the dark side of Hollywood's golden age remained a hidden secret, a cautionary tale spoken of only in terrified whispers among those who knew the truth. The star was forced back onto the soundstages, the heavy makeup applied once again to cover the pale exhaustion, and the cameras rolled as if nothing had ever happened. But for the audience who looked closely at the silver screen, the eyes of the idol no longer reflected the joy of the spotlight, but rather the quiet, tragic resignation of someone who had realized that the walls of their beautiful prison were too high to ever scale. The history of old Hollywood is a masterclass in the creation of pristine public facades designed to conceal severe structural pressures. At the height of the studio system, production executives possessed total contractual authority over their talent pools, treating iconic actors as corporate assets rather than human beings. The rigid formatting of early studio contracts systematically dictated public appearances, restricted creative autonomy, and strictly governed personal relationships to protect box office profitability. Judy Garland, Mickey Rooney, and MGM studio chief B. Mayer. Istochnik, Wikimedia Commons. The reality behind the spotlight. While historical publicity imagery, such as the archive photo above featuring a young Judy Garland, Mickey Rooney, and Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer chief Louis B. Mayer, frequently portrayed an environment of wholesome, high-spirited mentorship, the authentic operational reality was highly transactional. Major figures like Judy Garland faced relentless, round-the-clock schedules, highly restrictive diets, and a forced reliance on medications designed solely to manipulate energy levels and sleep cycles to keep pace with rapid studio production lines. The structural imbalances of this era eventually sparked monumental labor battles and landmark legal challenges by stars like Olivia de Havilland and Bette Davis, permanently rewriting the dynamic between creative talent and entertainment industry conglomerates.